What an honor. I'm Reverend Karen Brammer. I'm the manager for the Green Sanctuary Program, and I co-coordinate this Environmental Justice Practitioners Network with Ali Tharp, with UU Ministry for Earth. And thrilled tonight to introduce Mel Hoover and Rose Edington, whose work I've known for a long time, and many of you probably read the introductory remarks that were on the invitation to participate this evening. But the thing that I think that really drew my attention to Rose and Mel, that I really wanted to learn from, is the Clean Water Fund that they created in West Virginia as a result of the 2014 and 16 disasters in West Virginia, water disasters. So Mel and Rose, I told them that they're kind of icons in our association because they've done so much, and you can read a lot more about them if you'd like. But I guess I really wanted to just say that we are so excited to learn from you, Rose and Mel, about what it takes to create the groundwork that can grow such a powerful project like the Clean Water Project. So with that, I'm just going to ask you if you would do an opening reading for us, and then however you'd like to begin, by telling stories or offering information, we'd be happy to hear.
Should we still do that?
Sure. Thank you, Karen. And
we bring you greetings from the colony of West Virginia. And what an honor it is to be asked to share this time with you and to share some of the factors, forces, and events that have shaped us and our approach to ministry and change. We also want to say that we tuned in last month, and we really appreciated Clyde Grubbs' presentation on colonialism. And it's relevant to what is going on in our state, a beautiful place where too often colonialism and capitalism go hand in hand to exploit natural resources and people. It gives us plenty of opportunities for organizing resistance and resilience in the places where race, class, gender, and environmental justice intersect. If you think not being from West Virginia exempts you from colonialism, dig deeper where you are and listen to the stories in your community that will tell you, and let them tell you, of their experiences. But before we go any further, we want to share some centering words, because in doing justice work, we need all the help we can get. And we UUs have a solid heritage to support and inspire us. We adapted these words from a section of James Luther Adams' reading, I Call That Church Free, which we renamed to I Call That Faith Free. We hope they will be helpful to you as you continue your involvement with intersectional justice work.
And just to be clear, I knew James Luther Adams when we lived in the Boston area, and I was working at Arlington Street Church where he was a member. He is, for those who might not know, was a UU minister and one of our chief theologians, and taught for many years at Harvard Divinity School. So his words adapted. I call that faith free, which enters into covenant with the ultimate source of existence, that sustaining and transforming power not made with human hands.
I call that faith free, which is open to insight and conscience from every source. It bursts through rigid tradition, giving rise to new and living language, to new and broader fellowship.
It is a faith for journeyers and migrants, a servant faith on an adventure of the Spirit.
The goal of a free faith is the prophethood and priesthood of all believers, the one for the liberty of prophesizing, and the other for the ministry of healing.
I think one of the reasons we chose that is because, particularly where James Luther Adams talks about our free faith is for the prophecy and the priesthood of all believers. Because our philosophy when we were working with our congregation was one of mutual ministry. And we felt that there are people who are involved in more of the spoken out part and the advocacy and being in front, but there are also the people who are involved sometimes more quietly in the healing ministries and making sure that everything is going as it should. And because of this kind of philosophy that we had a mutual ministry, we did not have a social justice committee. We talked to the congregations intentionally, we did not, because we wanted it to be a social justice congregation and that everyone had some kind of ministerial role towards social justice.
So part of our belief in saying that was we wanted to find a way for us to be supporters of and enablers of the ministries that different members in our congregation were engaged in, or the activities the way they understood it, and to honor that and support that and connect them with other parts of our congregation and other members as a way of creating a larger collective commitment and activity and energy. So that's been kind of something, at least for us, that worked, and that we think is something that helps as an approach to see it in that way. So it's one approach. It was our approach. That doesn't mean around others. We're clear about that.
So we thought we would tonight share some stories from our ministry here in Charleston, West Virginia, where the congregation really has a reputation for advocating on social justice issues, and also figuring out how to be a good institutional neighbor where we are in the city. So really these stories are part of an overall story of building relationships and trust. Well, because it's good to build relationships and trust, and because the world is unpredictable, as we have learned, particularly with the water crises. So you just never know how events are going to unfold that will make you glad you've got relationships and community trust when you really need them. So we'll begin with a somewhat funny story that kind of tells you a little bit about the congregation, and sort of symbolic in a way of its commitment to environmentalism and also for getting along with one another when things don't quite go as planned. The congregation was formed in the 1950s as part of the fellowship movement. So most of the members were highly educated, high income, many chemical engineers. Kind of a paradox that they were the chemical engineers and we are known as Chemical Valley, and we have to deal with all the pollution from the chemical plants. But they were also very great tree lovers. So they decided as engineers that as the congregation was growing, that they could build their first building. And there was, some people called it puny, some said it was just a nice little tree that was growing in the area where they were going to have the porch for the building. So they were going around and around in circles, figuring out how to build the porch around this tree so they could preserve it. And then one day they all showed up to work on the building, and somebody had taken an axe and the tree was no more.
This is, should we say who it was?
I think we should say who it was. We should say that Meg Riley was a member of our congregation for several years.
And their family.
Meg did not cut down the tree, but her
father did. But it unblocked the logjam, and what folks have been fighting over crazy stuff feels a lot like what's going on in our country right now. And they found a way through. And actually that really became, people could laugh about it, and became kind of one of those reminders in some tough times. Remember when? Let's get over this and figure out how to make a difference and solve things. So that kind of got embedded in the culture of that congregation. Let's not just complain, and let's not just kind of philosophize, but what can we do?
And also, when we need to forgive one another,
how do
we need to do it.
It's important to do that. So they were there for a number of years, and then they did outgrow that site. So they began to ask themselves, where else can we go that will work, and where can we also carry our values into the community and find ways to challenge ourselves? And so they looked and looked, and they ended up finding a spot, this wonderful, it's kind of a dilapidated, to be honest, house on the major boulevard, Kanawha Boulevard, which is the main thoroughfare through Charleston and along the river And on the other side is the railroad tracks and the mountains. So the whole history of West Virginia you can see layered by just coming through this stretch.
And by looking out the front
windows. And looking out the front windows. So they looked at that and said, wouldn't it be nice to look out our windows? So they decided to locate the church in that way. And they, it turned out that the house was, in fact, important in ways that people didn't always know initially. But it was actually the last house of the superintendent of Negro schools in West Virginia. And also had been an effort by Wilma Rudolph, when she was living in the community. She wanted to establish the National Track and Field Museum and actually wanted it to be in Charleston. And that was the site that they were trying to initially have it on. So anyway, there's this history, and folks kind of were excited by that. But what more excited, they were excited by these great magnolia trees. Three wonderful, the Trinity of Magnolias, as we were called. And they stood there like on a boulevard, and they were magnificent, and everybody wanted to see them. And so, but the problem was, how do you build a church and preserve magnolias? And the architect couldn't figure it out, but Bill Kresser, who was an engineer, and he says, I think I can figure out how to place this on the land. And he did, and he came out with this unique design. And I know this sounds kind of crazy, but there's something about what happened, because one of the things about that building, that space, and it's not just us saying that, however they did it, it has, you just go in the building and there's a feeling. People will say it who've never been in it or come for an event and say, wow, this place just feels so nice. And of course, we laughed because it was a plantation once upon a time, and the whole sense again about the history and connecting. So all these elements again of being sensitive to race and class and the environment and stuff, again, were unexpectedly part of what we were exposed to and have become part of the fabric of how the congregation has seen itself and rooted itself.
Yeah, I think it's just important to say that we used the house that was there and adapted by adding the sanctuary onto it.
Right.
So they had to make the sanctuary in kind of a unique placement, almost like a diamond shape, to make sure that they could preserve the trees. And they also chose to be on the west side, not only for more visibility because it was on the boulevard, but the west side of Charleston is the neighborhood with the highest number of African Americans in the city, and actually I think in the state.
In a neighborhood, it's a concentration in the state as an interracial community.
So part of the issue in moving there, I guess, was to figure out how to be good neighbors. What does it mean to be a good neighbor in a predominantly African-American neighborhood? So we had some recently retired teachers and some other people who just had a lot of energy to try to figure that out, and they decided the best way to find out would be to listen to the neighbors. So they put together a survey, and they went to the schools and they talked to the principals, and they went door to door and talked to some of the people. And they discovered that the school system really was lacking, at least in that neighborhood, for enrichment with science, math, and the arts. So they decided to start a program that they called Creative Capers. And sometimes they did things throughout the year, just single events that were a creative caper. And then they put a lot of energy into doing a 1-week camp in the summer, a day camp for the kids in the neighborhood. And they were also interested in justice for people. So it wasn't all volunteer for the camp. When they hired teachers and professionals, they felt it was really important to write grants and to figure out how to pay people who were actually going to work in the camp, as well as there were volunteers. A lot of volunteers from the congregation were part of that.
But it brought the community in a different way. One of the things is that a lot of the kids at that time didn't have a lot of those activities. And we had just, the schools and others, be honest, they were in school, the session.
Yeah, we have a year-round school in that neighborhood.
In that neighborhood. And so one of the things is we had to meet with the school and talk about what we were doing and why we were doing it. And actually the school got on board. In fact, they would recommend some kids who could attend, and as well as others in the community. But not only that, they gave credit for they thought our program, they actually gave them as, right, they weren't counted as actors. They saw that as a positive. And that created a positive feel from the community towards the congregation, in a sense that we took seriously their issues and their concerns, We listen to them and we're trying to do something. I mean, I know there's a lot of basics. I'm talking to a lot of smart folks out there. We're just describing how it happened in our setting. But that's always a situation for us, instead of trying to decide how to push our faith out or how we need to do things, is to ask the question, are we? We're part of this community. What do they need? What's the value? What do we bring to it? And what do people need from us? And what do we have to offer? Because one of the things is, I think sometimes you use, at least in our justice work, have often underestimated some of the gifts besides thinking that we can bring in terms to the situation. And I think that was important for people to see us in that kind of way.
I think it's also important to know when to stop a program. So this went on for at least a dozen years, 12 to 15 years. And the neighborhood was changing somewhat. And it's almost like our camp was a catalyst of doing this.
People stole our ideas, is the point.
So the Clay Center came in and they started offering an arts camp. So other people started to pick up on the camps, and there's a whole slew of neighborhood camps that are going on now. So we said, what is our need now? And there's a new neighborhood school that was built a few years ago, and we switched from doing our camp to being more involved in that school. So
that's a whole nother story.
That's a whole nother story. We won't get into it, but it's just realizing that once you start something, you don't have to keep it going forever, that there are other ways to assess and do things to make change.
So you want to talk about I think the other thing we were talking about, let's come back to the congregation. An event, when Rose and I had an interesting moment in our ministry. I was finishing up I was at a point in my work at the UUA, in terms of, some of you may or may not know, but I coordinated the justice work for many years and was part of the executive council, and was after the Journey Towards Wholeness and launching that effort and getting our anti-racism work at least started down the track, we asked ourselves a question. Our goal had been, we've worked together as ministers in different settings and different times in our ministry over the years. We've been around together around 50 years now, so this is a little bit that time, but we'd always had a vision of being co-ministers and doing something together. And I had been her boss in one setting, and we'd been co's in another institution, a religious institution, but we hadn't done a parish thing together, and had a bit of vision. And so we asked ourselves, what and where can we best serve right now at this moment in time? And thanks to Rose and her coming home, so to speak, I'll let her tell that.
Yeah, I grew up here in the Kanawha Valley in the town of St. Albans, which is just 10 miles from Charleston. And I'd actually been looking at a job with the UUA and realized that I couldn't take it because Mel was on the UUA staff. So then I was trying to figure out, what can I do? And Richard Nugent had done a year's interim here. And they were going to need a second year that he wasn't able to do. So he asked me to consider it. And so that worked out. And I just thought I would be here for that year, and that would be it. But 3 years later.
Well, but what happened while you were here?
Oh, okay. While I was here, I met quite a few people in the environmental movement. I met this wonderful organizer called Larry Gibson. We ended up bringing him to the GA back in Tennessee. But he was walking across the state to raise awareness about what was going on with mountaintop removal mining and how harmful it was, because a lot of people in the state weren't even aware of it, because you could hide it behind a lot of the trees and not realize the devastation that was going on unless you were really close to it. And he had managed to preserve his family's mountain that had coal under it and get everybody not to sell, in his family, not to sell out to the coal industry. And so all around him, the mountains were being blasted away. And he had been on the lowest mountain, and now it was the highest, and it was just flat land all around his one mountain. And he really had to let people know about the injustice of that and what it was doing to the water and to the air. So I walked with him across part of the state. And
we both did, actually.
And then Mel came.
I joined from the UUA as a supporter.
Which was
it was life-changing.
It was an amazing experience, because he had this he had his pickup truck that was all decked out with what he was doing and why he was doing it. And some people would cheer, and some people would come out with their fists raised and really be angry at us.
People tried to run him off the road. There were people who shot at him. I mean, he took his life in his hand, and he one of the, Larry's he's about 5 feet, and his little guy, but one of the biggest hearts, the bravest people I've ever known. And he would not back down. He was committed to saving the mountains and the importance of that to not just to him, but for the future. And I think that empowered us to ask again the questions. This guy is having impacts in ways that many other people have not. And he would say, I'm not very intelligent. I haven't got a lot of schooling and stuff, but he had courage and commitment, and he believed in it, and he was making something real. And I just think that's part of it. It's not so much his authenticity. And that's part of what we've tried to say. We want to can we bring our UU knowledge and understanding in an authentic way to people? And can we be with people authentically? Because that's what begins to win hearts. That what begins to get people connected and willing to try themselves something different. And so that was it. I mean, I'm sorry, I started.
That's okay. But for me, it was like, oh, I could see myself living here because people are actually standing up for themselves, organizing, trying to save the state. And it was something I didn't have a lot of awareness when I was in high school and in college about the issues. I mean, I knew there was coal mining. I knew there were problems from that, but I hadn't seen mountaintop removal mining until I came back and saw that and saw people organizing against it. And saw how the church was being helpful because the church was providing space for various environmental groups to have a meeting place. And we are less than a mile from our capital. So during the legislative session, the building would get a lot of use from the environmental organizations.
So when we were thinking about would we come to Charleston, and we had our pre-candidating time and whatever, there was this wonderful layperson from the community congregation named Catherine Stone.
And we mentioned her in the book.
And Catherine just simply said to us, I want you to meet some people from the community and let them meet you, and you understand, get a sense of what's going on. And so she put together this luncheon. And so she invited to it the various environmental folks, a number of them who met at our church, because at that time they didn't have a lot of place to meet. So we were off in the meeting site. So we had the forest folks, and we had the water folks and the mountain folks, and they all were meeting there. But the luncheon brought everybody together. And I guess we had some hint from the interim minister about the fact that he saw possibility but hadn't been able to act on it. So at the luncheon, I remember simply listening to folks tell their stories. And some of them were hearing each other's stories that they hadn't heard, even though they worked together and been out, they hadn't really understood all the stories. And I really was honestly impressed. I remember doing this. I don't know if you can see. I remember holding this up and saying, so here's what I see, that you guys have these wonderful separate entities, but what you've learned that most communities haven't is that if you take that and turn it into this, it can change the dynamic and bring power. And it was interesting because as we looked around, we actually know that they hadn't really done that, but they looked at each other and they began to say, yes, we can do that. And some of them had been in each other's groups. They had never thought about collective. And the reason that's important, because this was the beginning of how the water thing became possible. Because what happened is this coalition came together then in a very early stage. But it became...
Well, it became known as Friends of the Mountains because we have all kinds of bumper stickers for people who are with the coal industry that has Friends of Coal on their bumper stickers. So now there are an awful lot of people with Friends of the Mountains on their bumper stickers too. And there have been over the years.
But it coalesced the power, and the other thing we helped them do is to think about tying their power to the legislature and really fighting both inside the halls as well as outside. Because our basic philosophy, one of the things we brought is to say, if you want to have transformative change, you need a kick and a kiss. You got to be able to, you got to get the attention of the mule, so to speak, as they used to say, but that's not sufficient in and of itself. You got to know how also to change policy. and to be able to to develop structures in different ways, because if they stay the same way, they'll keep producing the same thing. And again, that was beginning to figure out what that means in this community and in this state. And that's part of the conversation that caused them to help, not cause, facilitated them in thinking about something together and to begin to project something together about what does the endpoint look like. And those kind of early conversations really built personal relationships. Over years, they built a level of trust and commitment that when action things would happen, we knew that we could call on that network of people and they would show up and they would be there and they'd bring their gifts to it. So this was all the groundwork we were laying years before, I say groundwork, for other moments that could happen.
And then another kind of simple thing we did is because we knew many of our members were parts of some kind of social justice group. And we just said simply identify yourself as you, and not just as an individual who's finding a meaningful way to express yourself. Think of yourself as a you. Invite your group to meet in our space. I know you can get into all kinds of issues with rental and calendars. Well, calendaring is easy. We knew that some groups could afford to pay a little something for space. But if a group couldn't afford it, we would think, well, this is part of our ministry to the community. And we would always put out an offering basket and say, if anyone can contribute to help keep the lights on for these meetings, thank you. And it was a way to get us more into the community, to invite more people in. I think one of the things that I got really excited about that I still remember so well, because of this, we ended up being seen as a safe space for, not just for here, but for other parts of the state, especially during the legislative session. We would have people from all over the state meeting there. Sometimes people from Kentucky would come in because they were also working on mountaintop removal issues. And I ended up getting really attached with OVEC, the Ohio Valley Environmental Coalition. That was the group Larry Gibson was part of when we walked across he walked across all the state. When I walked across part of the state, I ended up going on to their board. So the executive director got a call from the Obama administration, from the head of DEP, who said that they were in charge of making regulations, of course, for mountaintop removal mining. No one had ever come to see what a mountaintop removal site looks like. No one from the previous administrations, and groups from our state had been asking someone, the Obama administration, to come. So they called and said, we want to come in, we want to fly over and see the sites, we want to visit the sites, but we really don't want anyone to know that we're coming. We don't want the press there. We need to just come in and see what's really going on without having industry try to sway us. So they asked Janet, do you know where we could meet? And Janet says, yes, you can meet at the UU congregation. So we had about 40 folks from 3 different states and people from the Obama administration that we hosted. And it felt like an honor, and it also just felt like, wow, we're being heard for our issues here. And some good legislation and some good regulations came out of that meeting, which unfortunately haven't continued, but it was a real high point for that to happen.
One of the things too is that while this is going on, we're also trying to keep with what are the human issues, what are the dynamics among honoring people and enhancing people, that pastoral aspect as well. And we're not unique in this, but in West Virginia, we were the congregation, the place that, quite honestly, the gay lesbian community could come. And in fact, when MCC was looking for a place, we literally were the only place that would provide them space. And so what started out initially as a temporary kind of effort was going along, Metropolitan Community Church, excuse me. But we actually developed a relationship, and we committed to try and help them grow. And so one of the ironies was that we have these reputation on the one hand as justice and environmental stuff, and then some people began to say, well, they're the gay church because we had provided space for the other, but that became an impart. So actually, yeah, you know, we got our buttons and stuff, so we say, yeah, we're the gay church. We like fun. We like to do wonderful things. And trying to, again, turn those things into not letting them be negatives, but how do we turn this lemonade kind of thinking? And that was just a great experience, and we even did some joint services with them and things like that. So we were trying to keep modeling the fact that you can't just do justice work alone, that you have to deal with the reality of empowering people and recognizing them. And they also helped us even be more involved in the gay pride community and stuff as well. And which was good for our folks. And we became, it's not that we didn't ever do that, and we had gay members of our congregation too, but we saw that as a way of Unitarian Universalist witnessing. So one of the things we did is we created a shirt, which was called, had on it, Standing on the Side of Love. Now, Meg Rowley reads our newsletter, you may know. And a few years later, we had our shirts. And we had, the difference was we had them on the back, and then we had our church on the front. But I'll show you the power of this. And I guess we had the shirts for about 2 years. First year we got them, actually. We had a pride rally.
No, it was Pride Parade Day.
Pride Parade Day, excuse me. And everybody was gathering. Well, we have a group of fundamentalists in the community that their job is to make sure when people gather, gay, lesbian, transgender, so forth, that they're harassed. And so they came to the parade.
They like to yell at us.
They yell at folks and bring folks and you know, make comments and wave Bibles and all that stuff. And so we had a booth, our congregation did. You could have booths and display stuff and just be there and crafts and stuff. So anyway, this one year, they just were very obnoxious. And everybody was saying, should we call the police? What will happen? A couple of police were walking by. They weren't doing anything. So finally, Rose and I were wearing our shirts. And we were sitting at the table. And it was like we didn't even really communicate. She started walking one way, and I started walking the other. And what we did is we ended up they were circling around in a circle. And so we simply, silently, we just simply started with our shirts facing them, walking backwards into where they were. And we just kept walking backwards. And as we did that, their circle kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And it got to the point they just stopped. And they dispersed. So our UU power,
our standing
on the side of love, was a weapon that conquered that. And I say that in a positive way, that sometimes what we stand for and the message we carry is powerful in ways we may not always think about. But it also, anyway, that's just one of those kind of fun and actually important moments of doing justice work as well.
But I think this also helps expand on the idea. I know it's siding with love now. I remember having a conversation, and I can't remember with whom at the UUA, and I was talking about siding with love and siding with love for the earth. And it was like, well, but this is for people. And I was like, no, that's too limiting. You need to side with love for the earth as well.
And that became a real issue for us several years ago at General Assembly.
When it was in Kentucky,
when it was going to be in Louisville, because we had just had Justice GA, which I'd been a strong advocate of before in Arizona, because I'd been for many years wanting us to do that. And we were excited about that. And then we got a call from the UUA saying, well, this time we're not going to do justice work. We're coming to Lexington, but you know, we think it's a great place. They've got great bourbon and horse racing and good restaurants and stuff. And basically, we were there, and some of the ministers of the congregations in Kentucky, and we were in touch with each other and said, you know, this is our faith. They're coming to party. They just came off this big commitment to justice. So they want to come here in Appalachia, and they don't want to do any justice work. And we simply said, that's not acceptable. So what we did is we drafted a letter to the UUA Planning Committee and to the board and simply said, you can't come and do a GA here if you're going to do that. And got this shocked response initially, but we gave a reason, we gave a rationale for it and said, there's these opportunities here if you want UUs to really have a chance to enhance and our own understandings and engage the people and stuff to do that, then this is the time we're willing to work with you. Well, what we didn't know at the time is because we opened our mouths, then they said they hadn't staffed it. So they said, well, we don't have the staff for it. So the local ministers in Kentucky and West Virginia formed this coalition.
We sounded so mighty.
And we sounded really mighty and stuff, all 8 or 9 of us in terms of who we were. And we literally planned and did that GA. And we built it around water. And that's where part of that started. I don't know if any of you were at that GA, but the focus was to say that water is something we all share, and the poisoning of it and the disruption of that in our lives and the importance of it is something that even our UU folks don't understand and haven't really fully connected. If you're in West Virginia, you know that they talk about coal as gold here. And one of the things we came in, we were in a legislative meeting, and one of the guys brought that up, and I looked at him and said, well, guess what? We also have platinum here. It's called water, because we have some of the best water in the world, and that's true. But it's being poisoned, it's being attacked. And some of the same ministers in Kentucky had some of the same feeling, because the Ohio River is something that we shared and how polluted it was and the connection. So we decided, how can we take that reality to share with UUs coming from around the country and try and say, here's something, if we all think this water is important, we can find a way in our communities to do something together. And out of that came a focus on water, a real shift in GA in terms of talking about environmental work in a different way. And I think that was important for lots of reasons, because it really began to be the shifting, the thought of thinking about how to think about this stuff differently. And I don't know if any of you were there, but we did this kind of, in the public witness, what we did is we took water from the polluted Ohio, and one of the congregations actually cleaned the water. And then when everybody was there, we talked about the process. We actually found a site that was down by the water. And what we did is we reached out to other local folks and said, how can we help you and empower you in terms of what you're doing? And they said, well, let us join you. Don't make it a UU thing. Can we join you? And we reached out and said, well, of course you can. We're in your community. And it turned out that we ended up not knowing when we started this with the largest demonstration for justice work actually in Kentucky's history. And that started out of our UU gathering in Kentucky. And then one of the symbols was that we gave everybody a veil of water and asked them to take it back to their community, to their congregation, share their experience, what was going on, and begin to ask the stories, or to look at what's the water, or what's the problem, what's the pollution in your community, and figure out a way to take a step to make a difference. And that just generated all kinds of response around the country, and just that simple little action.
I remember that vividly and brought it home with me and brought it to several services in worship in different places. It was very important, connecting people across the country. Mel and Rose, you too have thousands of stories, and I'm sure all of them we have a lot to learn from. And I don't want to cut you off, and yet people seem to be bursting with questions here. So I'm wondering if you have another story you'd really love to share, and then after that we'll invite questions and answers, or do you want to just go right into Q&A?
Maybe just a quick update.
Good.
We don't want to talk about our thing in the book because you've probably read it.
All right.
But our legislative session, well,
151 million first.
What, hon?
151 million first.
Right. We did get distributed just before Christmas, the settlement, $151 million going out to the 300,000 people that were poisoned. It took a long time to distribute because the judge was making sure that anybody, like was on welfare, that their checks would not change if they got something from the settlement. So, are you hearing us? Okay, because we're not hearing.
Yeah,
okay.
And not only that, one of the things we did, and Paul Dazell, who some of you may from our congregation, and several other people, he was in the food industry, and one of the things he was concerned about was what happens to the workers and the common folks. So one of the things we did is we set up a process and to track down all the people who worked in restaurants and hotels and everything, and to make sure that they got their forms and got them in so they would get reimbursements for their, we've been told it's been the most successful, fully subscribed, whatever, settlement effort in the country.
Class action settlement.
Class action was set in the country. And so that wouldn't have happened again without a lot of these kind of, this partnership and working together and stuff. And the congregation was central as a site and a place and the history of that and the trust. So, I mean, for what that's worth, and who knew way back when that this would be what would happen? That's all I'm saying. This didn't happen overnight.
Right.
But,
you were building relationships for a long time.
Long time. But again, about caring about people, building partnerships, building relationships, always learning, being open to learn. So anyway, that's a piece of what we wanted to share, right? Okay.
Right. Okay. And we feel like it's not done, of course, because it's like
we're still fighting.
Just one little slice. West Virginia American Water is a corporation. I feel like water should be city run because the corporation is guaranteed. The shareholders are guaranteed a certain percentage on their investment, no matter what else is going on. So a study just came out a couple weeks ago that we are losing up to 1/2 of our water.
50%.
Because the pipes and all are so old and deteriorating. And they figured out that it's going to take decades to replace the pipes because there isn't enough money. But if the shareholders didn't have to get their share, we could rebuild the infrastructure. So that's just
so many ways to keep moving the health and the healing and the well-being.
And there are still, I mean, in our poisoning was short-lived. There's a town of Prenter where people haven't had water for over a decade that's good.
But still.
And they've sued the coal company. Supposedly it was settled, but they still don't have good water. So
we'll stop.
We'll stop.
You know, one of the what I've seen come up in the chats is I can see people beginning to percolate about how you approached your ministry, and they're comparing their own congregations and wondering, you must have a huge congregation. How many people are in it? It must be thousands of people.
No, people think we are much bigger than we are. We have about 110 members.
120 members who are members of the congregation, but we have all these friends from around the state with their congregation. So we have a mailing list of, well, we did about 340 or 50.
About
and
110
would come in out of town and say, they identified, like the national level, they'd identified this was their congregation. They just didn't pay for it.
And this concept of not having a justice committee and everybody being responsible for justice, somebody says, does that really work? I mean, is it like 4 people who are doing it, or is it really a lot of people? Talk about that a little bit. Or a lot of it.
Well, it wasn't always, the issue was we allowed for multiple things to happen. So we tried to.
It wasn't all environmental. It wasn't
always environmental. Right, that's right.
And part of it was, I mean, when we came here too, the Iraqi war was.
We found it, yeah.
We helped found West Virginia Patriots for Peace to protest the war. More recently, we're the only congregation in Charleston that has a Black Lives Matter sign hanging out. And that went through a whole process with getting buy-in from everyone instead of just a small group saying we needed to do it.
I want to say something that was really important about that. Okay. And that's actually, it was starting when we were there, but also we were leaving.
We retired.
We were retiring. And so it was also the follow-up in the congregation and the interim minister. That a lot of you churches were saying it's the right thing to do and we're going to get behind it and stuff. And as did the congregation there. And they were ready to go out and put the sign up. And she says, I don't want to do that. Let's think about doing this. Patricia.
We need to be deliberate about what
she
we're
says,
doing.
why are we doing it? Are we doing it because it's easy for us? It's our way of looking good? Or do we mean it? And so the congregation went through a conversation within itself about why do we need to do this? And what does it mean for us? But not only that, it said we need to find out if our neighbors, we have two major congregations right by us, one on the other side of the street, a big one. African-American. And so part of it was we want to talk to them and tell them what we're thinking. We want to know, would this in any way be insulting? Would it be important? Would it be useful? And that started another kind of dialogue, honoring and respecting folks. And it made a huge difference because that word really got out in the community. So it finally ended up that it not only, there were some people who initially were kind of negative in some of the reports, but it became actually in the newspapers and others, as the story got unpacked, it gave a different slant to it. And we actually had a formal invitation for people to come while it was hoisted up and that whole kind of thing. So again, it built community and it helped educate at the same time. And it was respectful of the folks who we were trying to help, but not doing it for them, but with. Makes sense? That's part of it. So, you lost.
So, is there a particular?
Rose, maybe we could close out the recording, read the reflection one more time, and then have some open discussion with the folks on the call. Does that work?
Whatever works for you guys. We're glad to do it.
Actually, there's a poem we'd like to share for our closing.
Perfect. Yes.
Let me turn this up. Go ahead, Mel.
1 second.
Oh. Okay.
So basically, Rehowe's poem, Singularity, and it helps express this nearly inexpressible sense of connectedness.
Marie teaches eco-spirituality at Sarah Lawrence, and this is an excerpt from Singularity. Do you sometimes wake up to the singularity we once were, knowing that every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you? Remember?
Would that we could wake up to what we were when we were ocean and before that, to when sky was earth and animal was energy and rock was liquid.
Before we came to believe that humans were so important, can molecules remember it? What once was?
No.
No I.
No we.
No one.
No verb.
No noun.
Only a tiny dot brimming with is all.
Everything.
Home. So may it be.